Imagine dreary and smoggy industrial London, England, in 1866. Under the cover of darkness, a shadowy figure approaches a book publishing house and drops off an envelope. Inside was a diary. No one knew where it came from, or who it belonged to, or how it got there. It was written 15 years earlier, but who by, no one knew. There was no author's name on it, and in a curious detail, any names that were mentioned in the diary had been carefully scratched out. Have you ever dreamed of getting away from it all? In a world that's constantly being barraged by ads and information, by responsibilities and anxiety of stress, and, well, have you ever just wanted to go off into the woods and live alone for a while? Well, this mysterious journal was the diary of one man who did exactly that. His diary, telling the story of his time in the forest, paints this achingly beautiful and deeply poetic portrait of the untouched Canadian wilderness. It's been compared to Henry David Thoreau's Walden. When these London book publishers arrived the next morning and found the envelope, they were astonished by the quality of the writing and the emotion that shone through. The book was published and it became a minor literary sensation, but its mysterious author still to this day has not been identified. Today we're going to explore this diary written by a mystery author, and we have a special guest voicing the diary in this episode who is also a mystery man. The admin of the absolutely massive Instagram sensation Canadiana page, canada.gov.ca. Me and the admin actually went to school together years and years ago. After I wrote my first ever story about the Lake Utopia monster, and it absolutely blew up on social media, he reached out and he pushed me to, well, if I'm honest, he kind of bullied me into actually doing something with it and turning it into Backyard History. And actually, he pushed to call it Backyard History, claiming, rightfully as it turned out, the name I preferred, which was, quote, Andrew McLean-writer, was probably not going to catch on.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
On board the ship, July 24th, 1851. I can hear the hoarse rustling of the water as a fine easterly breeze urges our ship through the slowly heaving waves of St. George's Channel. The land is vanishing, and we are fairly at sea. I am the only passenger, and the loneliness of a solitary passenger at the beginning of a voyage is perhaps as complete as if he were at the North Pole. Then how intensely real becomes the parting with his friends, those friends some of whom he may see no more. Through the open door comes the rustling sound of the wind sweeping through the rigging, the sigh of the sea under the side, the ship dancing. I may as well begin what I hope may be the means of beguiling the tedium of many an uneventful hour in the 5 or 6 weeks before us. That oft-told tale, the oldest of tales, a journal at sea. But as old as the tale may be, it is incumbent on all voyagers who can write to inflict their stories on those who live at home.
So begins the mysterious journal of the unknown writer as he set sail from England. 16 years later, that journal would somehow end up in the hands of a book printer in London, England, and would be published as a book called Journal of 2 Months on the Tobic. The publisher's brief introduction fleshed out what little was known of the author. He was certainly not a rich man. He was more than familiar with going hungry. He had little to no formal education, yet was clearly a talented writer. He was not a skilled tradesman. Instead, he worked as a manual laborer. While aboard the ship crossing the Atlantic during the 6-week voyage it took him to reach Atlantic Canada, he marveled that he had had many other adventures before this one.
I have contrived to cram a good deal of life into my few years of existence, Almost too much, I sometimes think. And now, by this sudden flight of mine across the Atlantic, am I about to greatly swell the already unruly river of memories?
He does mention that he had spent the last 7 years in Australia. He doesn't actually mention what he was doing there, though. But just going by some contextual clues that he dropped, my personal guess is that he probably went there as part of the gold rush. So assuming that I'm right and he was looking for gold the past 7 years, I think he may have found some. Maybe not a generational fortune amount of gold, but some gold. Because this would explain how he, just some random working class guy from a poor family with no education or trade, could afford to travel the world, seemingly on a whim. And it really was very much a whim that brought him to New Brunswick. You see, back when he was living in Australia, he dreamed of moving to California. But then one day, deep in the Australian bush, he found a discarded newspaper from Scotland, of all places, called Chambers Journal. In this newspaper he found in Australia was a story of a man surviving in the forests of New Brunswick. After a long search, I actually did manage to find that first article, which inspired our mysterious writer. And I've got to say, it is not very inspirational. It recounts the story of a man from Fredericton named John Grant, who got lost in the woods for 5 days and 5 nights straight. It rained the whole time. Then things got worse, and the rain turned to snow. With no food, freezing, and dying, John Grant tied his handkerchief on an alder tree to mark the location of his body, and he laid down and he curled up in a 3/4 circle to wait for his death. And then this passing group of lumberjacks spotted the handkerchief on the alder tree, came over to investigate, and saved John Grant's life. Now, like I said, it doesn't sound very inspirational, and the article is actually every bit as bleak as that synopsis sounds. It was clearly intended as a warning for others to be careful in the forests of Canada. But somehow, our mysterious stranger read this, and he thought,
I remember reading it and being strongly impressed by it several years ago. Little did I dream when reading it in the Australian bush that I should be led, in the course of my own wanderings, into the scene of this adventure.
Our mysterious writer's ship docked in Boston, where he met his first ever real-life New Brunswickers. He excitedly told them about his plan to go live in the woods, but much to his surprise,
they seemed quite puzzled as to what I am doing, and wanted to know if I was surveying the road or wanted to settle. I told them I was doing neither of these things, but only wanted to see the country.
He quickly traveled to St. John. He arrived in the city by ship, not overland, so he was quite shocked when he got there to find not the forest that he had expected, but a rather large industrial city. This was not what the magazine article from years earlier told him New Brunswick was like. The year was then 1851. This was the peak of the famous wooden shipbuilding era, which many people have called New Brunswick's Golden Age. In the previous 30 years before our author showed up, the province's population had absolutely exploded. It went from only 25,000 people to a staggering 200,000 people just before our writer got there. The writer was shocked and he was appalled at the size of St. John, and he quickly left. He took a steamship north to Fredericton. There's a kind of a recurring strange subplot in his diary where basically our writer is very lonely. He desperately wants to meet a woman, basically any woman. He is not very picky as to who. He basically falls in love at first sight with every woman he meets, but sadly for him, he is very much afraid to actually talk to women. There was actually a pretty funny example of this aboard the steamship. So he's on the steamship, going on the river up towards Fredericton. He's sitting on the deck, and this pretty young woman walks by carrying a chair. He jumps up, and to show he's a gentleman, he takes the chair from her to carry it for her. He doesn't start a conversation with her because, as I said, he is very scared to actually talk to women. So he just takes the chair and he starts carrying it for her. The young woman walks with him and she tries to start a conversation as he carries her chair. He gets all flustered by this pretty girl talking to him. He sets down the chair and he scurries away without talking to her. But that wasn't actually where she was carrying her chair to, so she had to pick up the chair and carry it to where she was going. So that was actually probably his most successful interaction with a woman in the whole diary, because there was actually some conversation. Usually he doesn't get that far. So his steamship arrives in Fredericton, and he does track down John Grant, and that was the guy who nearly died in the forest. He discovered from talking to John Grant that the near-death experience had not happened on the outskirts of Fredericton, like he thought, but rather a considerable distance to the north, on this river called the Tobic.
I am indebted to Mr. Grant for much valuable information. Few know the Tobic River better than he does, and good cause he has to remember it. For there, indeed, he came near to end his days. He lost himself in the forest, wandered for some days in the most inclement weather, without fire and without food.
Astonishingly, based on this meeting with this man who had a horrific near-life-ending incident, our writer decided to go up to the Tobic to live in the woods. He hitched a ride on a wagon with a soldier up to a brand new farming community that was freshly carved out of the forest named Stanley. It was only while on this wagon ride, passing along a freshly cut forest, that he actually saw, from close up, a Canadian forest for the first time. And he was frightened by what he saw.
The almost impenetrable forests seemed to me but little better than a large prison, surrounded on all sides by high and gloomy walls. Wooden walls, indeed, a howling wilderness. The only exit a road I could almost compare to a dark underground passage, overshadowed and confined as it is by the woods.
When he told the soldier his dream to live in the forest, the soldier flat out told him his idea was crazy. The soldier told him stories of people going into the forest and getting sick, of getting injured, of getting lost, getting broken bones, suffering malnutrition, getting attacked by animals, until finally the soldier convinced the narrator to, at the very least, find a guide to bring him into the forest. The soldier made a considerable detour to an indigenous village along the way, and he basically just drops our unnamed writer off there. It seems like the soldier did not want to be a part of this man going off on what, in the soldier's mind, was surely a death sentence. The indigenous village isn't actually named in the diary, but I believe that it was probably Meductic. At the time, it would have been a fairly sizable Wolstakiak town, but today it is now underwater. It was submerged by the construction of the Mactaquac hydroelectric dam in the 1960s. In this Wolstakiak village, our unnamed writer met Joe, who agreed to be his guide. Joe would take him into the woods and help him buy supplies and get set up, and then he would leave him. The narrator doesn't say how he met Joe, and he doesn't describe Joe, but he did comment that Joe wanted to be paid in advance. Joe demanded 6 New Brunswick pounds as his fees, plus a further 1 New Brunswick pound for supplies. I never quite figured out how to convert New Brunswick pounds into today's money, but rest assured that Joe was definitely getting paid very well. At one point in the diary, Joe let slip that this money he's getting paid from the writer is enough to feed his whole family for the entire winter, right through until spring. And Joe has a family of 6 kids, so, it's not insignificant. The two of them canoed up the St. John/Woolstook River. Today people can get kind of riled up on social media over what to call that river, whether the English name the St. John River, the indigenous name the Woolastook River, but back then, back in the 1850s, and even going back further to when settlers first arrived, those two names were used interchangeably. Sometimes I've even found in writings, in the same sentence, a writer would interchangeably use both words for the same river. so they canoed further up north towards the Tobic River. And they still kept passing farms. This was not acceptable to the unnamed writer, because he wanted to be in absolute wilderness, no farms. Every night, though, Joe wanted to just go and stay in a farmer's house. Our unnamed narrator, however, wanted to camp, writing.
I didn't much like asking the hospitality of strangers when supplied with the means of camping out, unless the weather is very bad indeed, and I felt this disinclination more in New Brunswick than anywhere else. Under all circumstances, the stranger finds himself the cause of inconvenience to his entertainers. Their daily routine is interrupted and they look uncomfortable, while the guest is thoroughly so, mentally and physically.
That was just his excuse, though. Our unnamed writer explains in his diary that he didn't want to go into farmhouses because he thought that the farmers would be hostile towards Joe, and by extension him, because Joe was an indigenous person. At one point, they did in fact have to stop at a farm for shelter due to a heavy rainstorm. And the writer was absolutely astonished to find that the farmers did not, in fact, treat Joe any differently than they treated him, writing.
The farmer and his family received us very graciously, supplying us with forks to eat with and cream for our tea, treating Joe, too, with as much consideration as if he were a white man, setting a chair for him with all imaginable politeness.
That same night, our unnamed narrator saw, for the first time, the Northern Lights.
The wind had died away, and the clear sky over which the pale flashes of the Northern Lights streamed like waving locks of shining yellow hair. There is a mysterious, almost an awful beauty to these Northern Lights, in their thin, delicate loveliness, as though the gates of heaven were suddenly opened and the glory from within beamed forth.
As Joe and the unnamed writer moved up the river, the farms became fewer and fewer, and the weather grew colder. It was now late September. It turns out that the unnamed narrator knew virtually nothing about hunting or fishing. Joe showed him how to shoot partridge and ducks, and as well as fish for trout, although the narrator was particularly bad at fishing. The narrator, by this point, obviously seems to think that Joe is his friend. But just reading these same writings, it seems pretty clear to the reader that Joe finds the writer to be pretty ignorant. At one point, the two of them are just sitting around a campfire in silence. And then, totally out of nowhere, the stranger asks Joe if he can read. Joe, who had been just minding his own business, sitting there looking at the fire, slowly turned to the writer and asked him, "I can't read your language, but can you read mine?" The stranger wrote that he was surprised. He remarked that he didn't even know that indigenous people even had a written language. Joe, for his part, did not reply to this. As they traveled further north and grew more isolated, suddenly, one day, Joe became frightened. He'd heard the sounds of humans.
While we were skinning a moose, there passed on the other side of the island, hidden from us, a canoe full of lumberers, loudly singing and laughing. Joe looked up with some apparent uneasiness. As the voices grew closer, he became, or seemed to become, seriously alarmed, and spoke of a gentleman having been robbed and murdered on the river by such men as these.
This was a deeply disturbing moment for our unnamed writer. Lumberjacks had rescued John Grant in the story that inspired him to go up to the Tobic. Therefore, he thought of lumberjacks as friends. It was only when Joe panicked at hearing lumberjacks in the forest that it began to dawn for the first time on our unnamed writer that indigenous people were under attack. They were having their villages physically attacked by marauding, drunken lumberjacks. And it seems to have occurred for the first time that he realized that Joe's people were existentially threatened by the modern world. Settlers were encroaching on traditional Wolastoqey lands, and they were changing what Joe liked to call the original ways. The settlers' farms were moving onto land which the Wolastoqey had lived on since time immemorial, land which, according to the peace and friendship treaties, was supposed to be theirs. They were being relegated to live on a reserve system, but even the size of these reserves were shrinking. This was actually pretty well known, and at the time our narrator was there, it was extremely controversial in the cities. A brilliant young lawyer named Moses Purley was drawing attention to the plight of Indigenous people. He successfully guided, through government, a bill to protect Indigenous lands from encroachment by settlers. But, much to Moses Purley's horror, at the last minute the government changed a few words in this bill that he'd gotten passed. Instead of protecting Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey lands, his bill now made it even easier for settlers to seize Indigenous lands. Joe and our unnamed writer passed through one of these exact reserves that we're talking about in Tobique. It was called Indian Reserve Number 20 at the time that they paddled through it, and at that time it encompassed 16,000 acres of land. Today, that same reserve, which is now called the Tobique First Nations, is only 5,766 acres. Our narrator was deeply shaken to learn all of this, writing,
All this put me in a state of uncertainty. But then, Joe knew them well, and I did not at all. The lonely river was well suited to deeds of violence. No doubt the greatest ruffians of the country are occasionally found in the lumberers' camps. So, at any rate, I'll keep our firearms in a state for service.
After passing through the reserve and continuing on a considerable distance, well past Plaster Rock, something really remarkable happened. Joe revealed that his home village was nearby. It was this tiny, secret community deep in the forest where Wolastoqey deliberately chose to live by what Joe called the original ways. I couldn't quite figure out exactly where the location would have been based on clues in the diary, but there's this one absolutely fascinating passage where our unnamed writer captures life in Joe's secret village in this really incredible way. He sat down on the floor inside of a wigwam, he pulled out his diary and his pen, and he just wrote down the scene that was happening around him in real time.
While I am writing this, I am sitting in a little hut resembling very much the usual shepherd's hut in Australia. Before me sits Joe's sister busily plating up a basket, which she has never raised her eyes from since my entrance. Beside her stands a small child crying bitterly because I looked at him. The village consists of 2 rows of houses, about 20 in number. Between them is the village green where, in fine weather, before their doors, family parties are cooking their meals in bright fires.
It appears to be at this specific moment when he made a big decision.
An idea has entered my head which sticks there. A plan is forming in my mind. I have not shaken hands with the wilderness, nor am I going to be satisfied with a moose or a few trout. The desire of my soul has ever been for the wild lands of the world and the free life of the bush. And now I can satisfy it. How can I refrain? No, back I will go and build me a hut in those dark forests ere the snow fall and the frosts enchain the river. And there I will await the coming of the mighty armies of the north. In plain English, I will pass the winter on the Tobique. In spite of the terrible lumberers whom to fear, I will seek the moose and the caribou and slay the cruel wolf. I will ask Joe to build with me a camp and show me where to seek the moose and the caribou, and will pay him more dollars in his pocket than I believe he deserves to leave me to fight in solitude my battle with the wilderness and the beasts thereof, and with fierce winters and the terrors thereof.
Joe took the writer to a spot far off in the forest to prepare to leave him there, alone. He taught the writer how to use a canoe, and he had also procured supplies for the trip. These supplies included
pork, biscuits, flour, tea and sugar, ammunition, warm clothing, cooking utensils, an axe and a small hatchet, a few tools and a pair of snowshoes.
Joe stayed with the narrator for 2 weeks. helping him to learn about the forest, the weather, and how to survive. Joe built our unnamed writer the place that he would soon call home, which he nicknamed Castle Lonely. It was a little wigwam on the Tobic. And then Joe left. And now our narrator was completely alone.
Hour after hour, day after day, week after week, pass and leave me in my forest home, a prisoner in solitude unbroken. If my health fails, there are none to help me. If my spirits sink, none to cheer me. If I wander off into the wilderness and die, none will ever know my fate. It is a wild, almost dreamlike sort of existence.
Nonetheless, he was very enthusiastic about being in the forest. At least at first.
How can we speak of the lifeless forest when its ever-varying voices proclaim all its troubles and fears? The gentle breeze it utters in low murmuring sighs its foreboding of the coming storm. And when the storm rages with harsh clangor, in groanings and writhings of its mighty limbs, it upbraids the merciless blasts as it rushes fiercely by. It finds a voice for its sufferings, tree answering to tree in cracks and the snapping of their tough ribs, as though a whole regiment of sharpshooters were skirmishing in the woods.
When night fell, he watched the northern lights.
The northern lights last night looked like a fluttering canopy of pale fire or yellow curtains blowing about.
As time passed, though, he didn't seem to be handling being alone in the forest all that well. He caught himself talking to the squirrels.
I sometimes carry on with myself. I am getting, too, into a habit of thinking aloud, and tell the silent trees my reasons for doing this or that, or why it should not be done, and comment on my progress to the squirrels.
Somewhat more alarmingly, as time passed, the squirrels began talking back.
The squirrels sit chattering their own opinions, or hold arguments with me on metaphysics and all the ologies.
And then something truly unusual happened, something which is, in the context of writing styles from 1851, much more unusual even than speaking to squirrels. This unknown man from more than a century and 3/4 ago began speaking to us. Even though he was clear that he didn't intend to have his diary read by anyone, he starts directly talking to you, the listener. The first time it happened was during a moment of panic when he got lost in a swamp.
A merry stream with its gentle clamor enticed me to a place which I soon wished I had never seen, into a cedar swamp that I could scarce extricate myself from, and then left me. I became naturally very anxious to get out again, but so would you in the circumstances.
He begins to realize that the forest is dangerous, and he warns you to be careful of slipping and falling. After all, a broken leg could mean certain death. And he started writing as if you were with him, and then he warns you to be careful.
A trip to the feet will send us sprawling on the sharp stump of a spruce tree, or a rotten tree with its look of solidity will trip us up. Hurry along, we tread on the slimy, slippery trunk, where the bark has fallen off and the foot glides from under us. May you now understand that the forests of America are not like garden lawns.
After he successfully hunts a partridge, he says,
If you, the reader, can't already sympathize with my delight, my exultation, there's no more to be said.
A recurring problem, though, was that now that Joe is gone, our unnamed writer had to face the fact that he really wasn't very good at hunting. The food he'd brought with him was beginning to run low, and he was by this point rationing it, meaning he wasn't really eating properly, which could explain the squirrels talking back to him. By mid-November, the weather is getting very cold. Puddles in the streams are beginning to freeze. And then came the snow.
It has begun to snow. Such snow as I never saw before. Minute like dust, like pins points, close, thick, a mist, a fog, a drizzling cloud of snow. Down it comes as though all the atmosphere were charged with it.
As he began to weaken from the cold and from not eating enough, his conversations with the wildlife began to get more in-depth.
I had an amusing interview with one of my friends, the squirrels, today. A moose bird completing the party. Mr. Squirrel came whisking up in a devil of a hurry, and squatting on a stump began nibbling and munching at something he had got a hold of most energetically, commenting thereon all the while with great volume, till the moose bird, overhearing him, joined us to listen to the jokes of the little humorist, who suddenly threw away what he was eating and vanished behind the stump with a hearty fit of laughter.
As time passed, with him eating less, he found his days preoccupied less by the sublime wilderness surrounding him, but by obsessions with staying warm. He had to devote large amounts of time to finding wood to keep the fire going, and he began getting obsessed with, unsuccessfully, ways to make his wigwam airtight. Once, when out hunting for firewood, he heard what had by this point become a strange and alien sound to him.
My ears were suddenly invaded by a sound I have not heard since the Wolstakiak left me. The human voice, except of course my own. 2 or 3 log canoes were toiling up the river, lumberers going to their camp. As soon as I heard them, I put my tomahawk in my belt, took my rifle, and watched them till they passed.
Much like Joe before him, he now feared and he even hid from the lumberjacks.
It rather amused me to think how little they dreamed that there was a lonely human being in these thick woods watching them from his lair. Much, I dare say, as the weasels and lynxes watched me when I passed unceremoniously by their hiding places.
Although we may at this point have some doubts about just how well his mental health is doing, we do have to admit that after a month in the woods, he's doing pretty well at surviving, all things considered. By this point in the story, there's a thick layer of snow on the ground, and the river is starting to freeze, and there he was, still safe, healthy, and relatively sane. He no longer held nature on a pedestal, though. He now viewed her as something to be respected.
For the wilderness has its lesson to teach. Hard may be the lesson, rough and harsh the teacher, uttering words of truth with a piercing voice and a frowning sigh. Yet it is a lesson to be treasured in the heart.
Dangers can strike quickly in the forest. In one moment, completely out of the blue, as he was chopping wood, disaster struck. His only axe broke.
The breaking of an axe is a small matter to him who has but to go to the next blacksmith's shop to repair it. But the blacksmith builds no shop in the wilderness. And when today the axe on which I had depended for very life in a New Brunswick winter divided into 2 halves in the hard crease of a sturdy maple, I could hardly comprehend the scale of my disaster.
It wasn't a total catastrophe, though. He had brought with him a backup, a smaller axe which he called a tomahawk, which we would probably call a hatchet today. So he was momentarily reassured, but not by much. He checked a stockpile of wood that he built, and he decided it was large, and he tested out the tomahawk. It was good enough to cut down softwood trees, although it struggled with hardwoods, like the maple that had taken out his axe. He felt reassured that he could make it through the winter. But that night, though, he found himself unable to sleep. He sat alone in the cold wilderness, staring at that little fire, and he was thinking and thinking and thinking.
I began to ponder seriously on my position. What if my only axe left me should break? I would be in a helpless state. Hitherto I had not seriously desired returning to society or opening communication with mankind. But now must such a way be found?
He wrote down his thought process step by step, examining how, in case of a crisis, he would get back somewhere, anywhere, with people. Could he walk? It was 22 miles through the forest to the nearest house. His only trail was blazes, and that means little axe cuts he made on the bark of trees that he was supposed to follow.
22 miles of wilderness is the equivalent to 40 miles of turnpike road, and in this deep of snow, equivalent to how many more? I should have to camp out to carry blankets and provision.
Only then, after 2 months living alone in the forest, did it finally begin to dawn on him the severity of what everyone had been warning him since the very moment he first arrived in New Brunswick. Just how precarious life can be in the wilderness.
The trees are my jailers, and grimly they stand around me, watching me in their glistening white robes.
He doesn't much care for this idea of doing a direct hike through the forest, so he tells us that he hatched another idea, but he won't tell us about what it is, in case it doesn't work out. 4 days before Christmas, his diary entry was only 5 hastily scrawled words.
My forest dream is finished.
He later revealed to us what he had been working on.
I have been carrying my notable mystery to a state fit for publication. It has now reached that state. Reader, I have made a canoe.
He had awoken that morning to find that the day was unusually warm. He figured that this might be the last ever chance he would get to get out of the forest. He hastily scrambled to throw some things into a bag, and he hastily scrambled out of there, abandoning his castle lonely forever. That canoe that he was talking about was to cross the river, which had not yet fully froze. It wasn't really a canoe, though, as we would understand it. Basically, what he had found was a fallen tree further down the river. He used his hatchet to carve basically a hole in it, and then at this point he paddled a dead tree trunk across the river.
Intolerable fatigue assailed me.
As darkness fell, though, he realized that he had made a huge mistake.
I had undertaken a task, the difficulties of which I did not discover until it became a matter of life and death.
At night, he slept in a bed which he wrote that he didn't think that we would have a high opinion on.
I retired to a bed you would think of as anything else but a bed. The mattress is spruce boughs, the blankets, a cloak and rug thrown on them. My coat is a pillow, hard bed, hard pillow. But with them sound refreshing sleep and pleasant dreams ever recurring of the faraway, of the light of other days, of the land where all my loved companions dwell.
He continued on overland, which he found out was much more difficult to navigate than even paddling his log down a frozen river.
Intolerable fatigue assailed me. The jerking of the strap made my back ache, and the strain on my knees made them totter under me. I had undertaken a task the difficulties of which I did not discover until it became a matter of life and death. Compelled every 10 minutes to sit down lest I should fall.
He was trying to find this lumberjack camp. He managed to find a clearing that they had once worked at, but the lumberjacks had moved on, and he couldn't find their camp. As he went through clearings, he wrote,
I was staggering with fatigue, and knew that if I fell I could not rise again. At last came the words, generally fatal to the traveler on foot, I can go no further. I sat down on my sledge, almost despairing. To take that further was impossible, but making a last effort, I got onto my legs, crawled a mile, and heard an axe ring hard by, saw smoke. Mid knew I was close to the lumberers' camp. I scrambled through the woods and saw a man chopping down a tree. With some anxiety as to the way I should acquit myself in the unwanted feat of conversing, I addressed him.
The young lumberjack sensed that someone was behind him and turned around before our narrator spoke. Remarkably enough, he was not the slightest bit surprised at this stranger that had come straight out of the forest and was now standing behind him. He said,
Well, you don't look so fresh as you did when you went up in the fell.
I found he had seen me when I hid from him in the forest.
The unnamed writer was brought by this young lumberjack to the camp. All of the other lumberjacks were gone, but the cook explained to him that
they had all heard of the Englishman who had been all alone in the woods. Then I sat down, and with a pot of tea, buckwheat cakes, and fresh pork instead of salt, soon forgot my sorrows. One by one came in the lumberers, jolly fellows, all knew about me, made them roar with laughter with telling them of my forest experiences, ate enormously, then found myself able to go back for the sledge, and brought it in, stumbling in the dark over rough ice.
So, something happens at this point in the diary, but I'm not quite sure the significance of it. That was the last entry written in pen. Everything to this point had been written in the same style, and these kind of long-form entries, which definitely marked our author's preferred way of storytelling, which he'd used the whole book. That's the last entry in the style. after this, everything else is written in a pencil, stuck towards the end of the book. He doesn't usually put dates in. He just kind of jots down short points instead of writing out long entries. I don't know what this means, but we can piece these together to try and figure out little bits of clues as to what may have happened to him. So after the lumberjack camp, he quickly moves on. On Christmas Eve, he returned to the Wolastoqey people's home with Joe's little secret village, and he spent Christmas with them. It turns out that the Wolastoqey did not believe that he was going to make it.
They were all rather surprised to see me alive, having taken for granted that I had been frozen to death long ago.
He left there on Boxing Day, and he was headed for Grand Falls. But this brutal cold snap kicked in that dropped the temperature to 39 degrees below zero. He stopped at a house with an elderly Irish immigrant farmer who, by the way, it doesn't seem that our narrator very much liked. He called him the craziest person in New Brunswick, and it seems like the feeling may have been mutual. The two of them ended up stuck there for quite a long time, too. This cold snap lasted until January 7th. In his notes, he's kind of talking about this crazy Irish immigrant, but it doesn't seem to dawn on him the significance of this. If he hadn't have left exactly when he did, he probably would have frozen to death in this cold snap. His plan from there was to hitchhike with a passing sled, but traffic was very infrequent that time of year, and it took him 2 weeks to get back to Fredericton. In Fredericton, there's an interesting note where he talked about having attended a dinner at the governor's mansion. And this was a really aha moment for me. I really read that entry and I thought for sure I could finally figure out who this guy was based on that clue. You see, not just anyone can have dinner with the governor. And everything about the governor's schedule was meticulously documented, and even today, 200 years later, these documents survive, and you can look up on any given night who New Brunswick governors had dinner with. So I thought I could find it, so I ordered up this enormous leather tome, which is like basically the size of my torso. It's all handwritten entries. It's kept in the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick, written with a quill and ink about the governor's schedule. I went through it and I found the date, but it turns out that while our narrator may have technically had dinner with the governor, this wasn't actually a private dinner. He'd gone to an open house. So with an open house, anyone could come to the governor's house. They could, technically speaking, eat with the governor, but the guest list wasn't written down. So there went my best effort to try and figure out who this guy was. And coincidentally, this also pretty much marks the end of his story, because soon after he stops writing. His rest of his short story it's unusual and it has a dramatic ending. The final entry is February 4th, 1852. He acknowledges in it that he stopped writing 2 weeks earlier, and he notes,
I must try and rub up my recollection of the last weeks before the events leave my memory.
He wasn't actually in St. John when he wrote this entry, though. He was aboard a ship going back to England. But something seems really wrong in this entry. His writing style's different, it's strangely clipped, it's disjointed, it's written in a pencil, and then he just stops in mid-sentence. And that's it, that's the end, that's the end of this journal. So, what happened? Why did he stop? Why did he stop in the middle of a sentence and never write again? Did he lose his journal? Did he fall overboard? Did he get sick and die on the ship? And if any of these stories were true, how did his diary appear on the steps of a London publishing house 15 years later? I don't have any answers to these questions. The only thing that I can rule out, though, is that there wasn't any shipwreck, because I did check on this ship and it made it to England safely. So your guess is as good as mine as to what happened with him. So I'm going to end this episode with the full, unedited final entry from this mysterious writer's diary, and you can decide for yourself what became of him. You can stay tuned. At the end of the episode, we're going to have a brief chat between the admin and I about this episode and about how he came up with the name Backyard History.
February 4th, at sea, aboard the ship named Borneath. I must try and rub up my recollection of the last week or two before the events leave my memory. On Monday, the 26th of January, I left Fredericton by covered sleigh. We had to cross the Ground Bay on the ice, a distance of 3 miles. Next, I fell ill. I was worse the next day. On Thursday, I kept to my bed and sent for the doctor. But I forgot to mention that on Tuesday night, in spite of it all, I contrived to hear the Dr. Lewis lecture on phrenology and mesmerism. Lecture room in Mechanical Institute, crowded, dirty room, stink of tobacco and brandy. A nasty fellow asks me for a chew. Lecture full of gesticulation and flowery language. Buffoonery never came to the point, left everything unproved. A lad comes rushing in afterwards, makes some electrical experiments, all of which are of a most unsatisfactory nature. On Thursday, crowd collected around St. John's Hotel to see a man come and order breakfast. Did not, and why? St. John in winter, boys skating, girls sliding, everybody slides. Pretty girls delicately smiling. St. John in the winter, dangerous to go through the streets.
Right, so we're here with the guest voice actor for today's episode. This is the admin from the Instagram mega hit account, Canadiana at canada.gov.ca. Woo! So what did you think of our episode?
I thought the episode was great. I think like all Canadians love reading about a British person coming over and underestimating the terrain here and finding themselves in trouble. I was saying to you a minute ago, it really reminds me of Susanna Moody's Roughing It in the Bush. And I just think I think it's really neat to I'm excited as having just recorded it. I'm looking forward to sort of hearing it all back. So yeah, I think it's going to be great. I am getting a kick out of reading though, in the document here in front of me, how I'll be introduced at the beginning, where it says that I bullied you into changing the name of your entire project to Backyard History. As I recall, I was particularly, I think I'd had a few drinks when I phoned you.
I think that sounded like that may have been the case.
Yeah.
It was quite a late at night phone call.
It was. And I was like, this whole Andrew McLean -writer thing that you're writing under, I was like, it's just no good.
So this is like right after I put out my first one that really took off, which was about the Lake Utopia monster, a sea monster story. I didn't really see much of a future, obviously, of writing about a sea monster taking off. But the admin here was like, you got something here. I kind of saw what you were doing as what I was doing, but like further back and kind of on steroids. You were going deeper. You were sort of like kind of doing it from a more academic standpoint, but I thought it was great. Seemingly people were reading all the way through to the end of your writing. I mean, I think it was different mediums as well. Like you were more Facebook, I was more Instagram. And so I sort of saw that it was a different medium altogether. But I also just thought that, man, is the name Andrew McLean ever born? There's so many of them. Actually, I was just selling a book to someone the other day, and she told me that her ex-husband's name was also Andrew McLean. There's not me either, by the way. This was a significantly older person. But I think when I was in university, there was like 6 other Andrew McLeans at the same time.
Which is part of the problem. And I'm never going to have that problem with my first and last name. But I thought you needed something punchier. And while slurring my words, I'm sure, I said something along the lines of, why don't you just call it something like Backyard History from your own backyard? And I didn't think too much of it. And about a week later, you either texted me or called me back and said, I haven't thought of anything better than Backyard History. Do you mind if I use that? And I was like, hell yeah, man. Like, go to town. But I think it is a nice story too of two guys encouraging each other, and sort of doing something kind of similar, with the project that we both have in front of us. And instead of being, troublesome to each other, we've been nothing but supportive. So I think that that's really nice.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Thanks very much for the early push.
Yeah.
And we were just discussing this before too, but long before there was a Backyard History podcast, as soon as this sea monster story came out, he also bullied me to go on to another really big podcast, Jordan Bonaparte's Nighttime podcast, to read that story, which I was so nervous. I was just soaked in sweat, absolutely waiting for my time to go on and talk. I was beyond nervous for it.
It's funny, when I was asked to be on Nighttime, my girlfriend, now wife, that was the first time she'd ever really looked up from her phone when I told her I was going to do something with the account. I was like, I'm going to be on Nighttime. And she was like, what? Because she and I are both huge fans of that podcast. So that was one of the first times where she was very excited. So I've been nervous going on to Nighttime too. I mean, in terms of maritime podcasting, Jordan's a legend, obviously. I've referred to it as maritime ASMR in the past, because as someone living in Quebec, away from my homeland, it's been very nice to hear someone tell stories about where I'm from in a thick Cape Breton accent. So so shout out Jordan for sure.
Yeah, definitely fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much for coming on, being a guest, and thanks for the original push and the name, I guess, Backyard History. I should give a shout out for that. So thanks very much for listening, everyone.
Yes, thanks, guys.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.